Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Steven Pynakker, and I'm very excited about the guests that I'm having on today. But before we go, there's just a couple things I wanted to mention. Obviously, you can see it's a different background. Mormon Book Reviews is moving out of this studio. We will be getting a new one. So this is the old school background that I used years ago for the time being. This will be a temporary thing. Also wanted to also mention to folks that I will soon be interviewing the president of the Echo Water Company. And this is a really interesting product that I've been using for a couple of months now, where it adds hydrogen to your water. As a matter of fact, you can see it's activated, a little blue light there. It actually adds hydrogen to your water, and it gives you a lot of energy. And so we do have in the description a promo code, Mormon Book Reviews Mormon Book Reviews is the promo code. And you can definitely get a 10% discount by using that promo code. I don't get any money from that. I just get a free bottle. So this is, so I just want to let you all know that as well. And also this author, my friend, my homie, Kyle Beshears, has just written a new book, and it's coming out on February 24th on 2026. We're taping this on the 23rd. And before we get started about the book, I just wanted to mention that we're going to do a book giveaway, and it's going to be a little different this time. So Kyle has two signed copies, or will be signed copies, of his latest book, 40 Questions About Mormonism. And we're going to do it a little differently this time. The first two people to email me at mormonbookreviews@gmail.com will get a copy. Now, you need to live in the United States. You need to be, contiguous United States, because we can't, he's going to be paying for the postage. And so we can't be sending this thing out to Europe or anything. But if you're an American, 48 contiguous states, and you'd like a copy of this book, go to mormonbookreviews@gmail.com. Just put in the subject heading book drawing, and Kyle will get those copies out to you. So Kyle, okay, so dude, you wrote this book. Now, I also want to point out, this is really important, folks. This book, called 40 Questions About Mormonism, is actually part of a series that Kregel Academic is writing about various topics. Kregel is a very important evangelical publisher. This is not an insignificant book. Matter of fact, I've spent a lot of time reading it, and there's some really important things that Kyle talks about. And what this book is intended for, really, is for an evangelical audience who might have questions about Mormonism. And this will serve as an introduction to Mormonism to a largely evangelical audience who probably don't know a whole lot about Mormonism. And I think this is an important book because this is not an anti-Mormon book. And that's, to me, is so important because for too long, evangelical publishers have been putting out anti-Mormon materials. Some of the materials has been good. Some of it's been academic. There's been some really great stuff out there. But largely, most stuff published by evangelicals about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the Mormon movement in general has been anti. And this is not an anti-Mormon book. That's why I think it's important. Kyle, welcome to the program. So glad to have you on today.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, for having me. Excited to talk about the book. I'm excited for it to finally be out in the wild.
This is great. I'm so excited. And of course, I wanted to mention that Kyle will be making the rounds to various Mormon podcasters, but he reserved, this is intentional. This will be the very first interview about this book. And thank you for honoring me, being such a good friend, for giving me the privilege to be the first person to have the first whack at this book. So I'm really excited about it, man.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, we talked about this, I think maybe over a year ago at this point, that I was like, I want MBR to be able to talk about it first. So I'm glad
That's
we
great.
made it happen.
I love it. Well, before we get started talking about the book, I really think it's important. I've had you on, but it's been a while since you've kind of given your backstory. And maybe just,
Yeah.
so Kyle, what got you interested in Mormonism in the first place? Now, folks, you gotta keep in mind, Kyle and I grew up in the same, basically very close to each other. He attended a church that was just a couple miles from my home.
Yeah.
Kyle and I probably were in the same room in multiple occasions, maybe same bookstores, multiple occasions, or libraries throughout the years, and never interacted. Maybe we interacted. We don't remember. But here are two guys from the region, couple region rats from Northwest Indiana, future home of the Chicago Bears. What are we doing so interested in Mormonism? And so the question to you is, of course, I've told my story, but Kyle, what got you so interested in it?
Yeah, I get the question all the time, and I wish there was like a really short answer I could give beyond it's really, really interesting to me. But there weren't a lot of Latter-day Saints where we grew up. There just weren't. And the first time that I remember coming across anything that has to do with Mormonism was a copy of the Book of Mormon I have here on my bookshelf. Um, this is a Sorry about that. This is an old copy. I'm sure some of
Yeah.
your viewers might be familiar with, but I saw this copy of the Book of Mormon on my grandfather's study. And he signed it and said where he got it in 1972. And similar to you, Steve, when because I've heard your story a number of times, when I opened up and I saw images of the inside of this book, I was
Mhm.
fascinating. So it wasn't the Freiberg paintings. I think that was your story, right? I
Yeah.
was looking at like, what are gold plates? What is this?
Yeah.
Another angel, a hill. It was, and then what's with the South American stuff? This
Uh-huh.
was just really, really interesting to me. As a child, I also, when I started learning about it, felt a little uneasy. I
Hmm.
think that's a common thing that evangelicals, when you first encounter Mormonism, you feel a bit of unease behind it because of the claims that it's making. So I remember very clearly being told, like, don't have anything to do with the Mormons. And it wasn't until I got into middle school, maybe even early high school, that the youth group I went to was shown the God Makers. So we had like a series where we were looking at the counter cult material. So we were learning about Christian Science and Jehovah's Witnesses, Latter-day Saints, Scientology. All of those get lumped together, and we watched the film The God Makers, and the cartoon part of it, which I'm sure your viewers are very familiar with it, was absolutely fascinating to me. The thing that I walked away from was there is no way there is an entire people group who believe that. So I had to know, and I started in my early 20s talking to like Latter-day Saint missionaries, and at the same time reading resources like Walter Martin's Kingdom of the Cults or his earlier book on Mormonism. And what I noticed is that the way I was being taught Mormonism from evangelical resources and the way that Mormonism was being presented to me by Latter-day Saint missionaries didn't match up. There was something going on. And I concluded that I was being misled or lied to from somebody. I just had to figure out who, right? If it was from my tribe, so be it. If it's from the LDS side, so be it. But I wanted to know. And this book, honestly, is essentially a report on years and years of trying to understand the Latter-day Saint faith and tradition on its own terms. That journey is led through numerous scholarly pursuits, right? So my PhD, I wrote my dissertation on James Strang's church after his death. I've presented on Latter-day Saint history at the Mormon History Association, at a BYU symposium. I'm a board member of the John Whitmer Historical Association. So actually, I'm really more interested in Latter-day Saint history. That's the
Hmm.
the part of the story that I'm most fascinated and interested by. But to come back to the book, what I wanted to do is I wanted to create a reliable resource for my fellow evangelicals who I'm assuming have never heard anything about Mormonism whatsoever. So we're starting
Hmm.
from square one. Or the things they have heard about Mormonism, they've drawn from just the zeitgeist of our culture, right? So they're thinking about the Book of Mormon episode from South Park, or maybe they've seen the Book of Mormon uh, musical. They've watched endless series on Netflix about devious behavior in LDS history or present day, whether it's the American Primeval and its representation of Brigham Young or the Jody Hildebrandt stuff that's come out recently, as if those types of things don't exist in our history, right? Or they were like me. They grew up with the God Makers, and once they saw it, their imagination of Mormonism hit pause,
Yep.
and it's never moved beyond that. I think for
Absolutely.
Latter-day Saints who are listening, that's the majority of us.
Mhm.
That's the majority of us. And as frustrating as that may sound, it's just the world we live in right now. So what I'm hoping to do with this book is provide a reliable resource for evangelicals.
Like Kyle, I just want, and this, of course, this very feels very autobiographical for me too, because we kind of have similar stories. And I'll just let you know, I literally live in a Christian community, and most people here do not even know that I'm doing this
Hmm.
because they would think that essentially this is a satanic religion, and that me engaging with these people, I might even be picking up evil spirits from these people by engaging with them. I mean, this is kind of the lunacy that's infected evangelicalism, in particular the charismatic and Pentecostal movements that have really gotten just so like wacky. So I don't even talk about it because it's hard for me to explain what I'm doing. And when I do explain it, so you're converting them, you're telling them that they're going to hell, and you're going to save them. I'm like, no, I'm just talking with them, and they don't even understand how that's even possible. And it's sad to see them having that warped mindset, because it's I just feel so bad for them to have like such dark thoughts about Mormonism in general. And I think that's why this book is really an antidote to that narrative. When we talk about like traditionally, and actually before we start talking about the book, we also want to talk about like this whole counter cult narrative. By using the term cult, immediately people think of Jim Jones, they think of Heaven's Gate, they think of David Koresh, and they think of cult leaders, and they think of these different people. And so when the term cult is used, or counter cult, like we are the true religion and everybody else is like kind of some kind of satanic counterfeit, that's kind of been the dominant narrative that's been around for a long time. Maybe speak to that as well. And you kind
Yeah,
of
so
already hit on it, but I want you to kind of really dig in there.
yeah, let me start from the end there and try to
Yeah.
work my way back because that's a lot of stuff that we could have a whole episode discussing. But for the term cult, it is a loaded word. I mean, there's no way around it. I I think there are parallels in the terms cult and evangelical in the sense that when people hear those words, they conjure in their mind things automatically. So the term evangelical, for example, it is meant to be a description, not prescription, but description of a branch of Protestantism that is very porous among the denominations and hold four theological positions, right? So you can be a Methodist or a Presbyterian or a Baptist, and you would be theologically evangelical. When you talk to 99% of people and you say the term evangelical, it has become inherently a political term since the 1980s. And at this point, I don't think that it's possible to retrieve the original intent behind that word. The same thing's happening with the word cult.
Yeah.
In an academic or a scholarly setting, of course, the term cult it comes from the Latin cultus, and it means a specific group of people behaving religiously in a specific way. And if you want to retain the word cult in that sense, that's fine, but you're probably in an academic space. The word cult, as far as our culture is concerned,
Mm-hmm.
are the Jim Joneses. It is the
Yep.
Marshall Applegates.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and for that reason, I don't think Mormonism can be considered a cult because a cult, the way we think of it, has a strong central charismatic figure of a really small following of people, and they're extremely controlling of the people who are within their movement, right? So I can already hear evangelicals say, "Well, you just described Mormonism because you have a prophet. They control their people." I've watched countless Exmo podcasters tell me their story about those types of things. Like, well, let me push back on that for a second. According to LDS Church statistics, there's over 16 million Latter-day Saints across the globe. So already we have a problem with the term cult. That's a lot of people. The second thing I would say is, well, look at the diversity of opinions that the Latter-day Saint Church tolerates. You have, for example, someone like Dan McClellan, who is a Temple Recommend holding Latter-day Saint, as far as I know, and then Jacob Hansen. Like you have a very wide spectrum of beliefs and approaches to scholarship or faith or religion or whatever that the Latter-day Saint Church tolerates. I struggle to see the term cult synchronizing with what I actually see the LDS Church doing. Are there cultic factions or cultic groups within the umbrella of Mormonism? Of course there are. Like it
Yes.
would be insane not to say that. Those are the Netflix series that
Yeah.
were watched, like Jodi Hildebrandt, right? That she was
Mhm.
definitely building her own cult. But is that all of Mormonism? No,
Right.
no. So I think we need to be responsible there with that word.
Hmm.
I was going to bring up a bunch of other things, but but I've forgotten. Um, yeah, maybe that's a hobby or a soapbox I didn't realize I was
Yeah.
going to stand on
No, I
here.
think it's important, yeah, that the definitions and the terms, like, people try to be so rigid, and that rigidity undermines even anything that really it's not helpful anymore. Like you've essentially, because you're trying to apply rigidity to things that aren't, like, for instance, like, what is an evangelical? Like, there are those who just have this like mindset. Steve Pynakker is not evangelical. Let me tell you why. And it has nothing to, it's like I'm some kind of caricature. I'm not some living, breathing human being who actually identifies as evangelical. And it's the same thing with the whole, term cult. It's just not; these are not useful terms anymore. Like you said, they've become something else. And so, I guess for you, like, why is that important that we move away from trying this rigidity?
Yeah, so that was one of the things that I wanted to bring up. Even if you're an evangelical and you think that Mormonism is a cult, ask yourself if it's wise to approach a Latter-day Saint in that mode, right? Is it wise to go up to them and be like, "Hey, you're in a cult"? Um, I studied new religious movements for my PhD in a seminar, and I recall one of the things that really stood out to me was that actual cult leaders depend on their members being called cultists. Because what it does is if you get an outsider who comes and says you're in a cult, a couple of things happen. First, the wall gets built up immediately, and they climb it, and then they're ready to defend because nobody likes to be told that they're in a cult. Second, it just reaffirms the fact that they're different. And this is precisely what their leader told them would happen, that they're going to be persecuted because the world doesn't understand them and the 30 other people that are meeting in this guy's basement, right? Like it's you are literally playing into the exact opposite of what you're hoping to do with a person who's actually a member of a cult. So even if I knew of a cult in my own city and I knew it was headed in a really bad direction, like Nexium, for example, I still wouldn't go up to those people and be like, you're in a cult, right? Because you've just completely abolished any hope of having any kind of communication with people. Again, who are actually in a cult. I don't think Latter-day Saints are in a cult. So all that was, even if you did, but I don't think they are. And I think it's unhelpful to continue to frame it that way, especially the language. And I see it and I hear it that all Latter-day Saints are a part of a mind control cult. Like that one is particularly frustrating to me because, ironically, it strips Latter-day Saints of agency, which they're huge on, like
Yep.
huge on. It doesn't take into consideration the wide diversity of views within the LDS Church that the LDS Church itself not only tolerates but sometimes even encourages. I can't wrap my head around somebody saying on the one hand that Latter-day Saints are a member of a mind control cult, and then on the other hand, somebody from Salt Lake City just said, you know what, would be a great idea. Why don't you go ahead and read the New International Version Bible for yourself?
Exactly.
How do these two relate? I don't see it. Again, are there mind control cultish factions within Mormonism?
Mhm.
Yes. I've also seen mind control cultish factions within evangelicalism. This is like
I
a fallen human condition
We
thing,
both
right?
grew up in the shadow of evangelical cults, dude. I
We
mean,
sure did. We sure did.
you
So,
know,
and I have one of their Bibles. Remember, I found it on so what we're talking about, viewers, maybe, well, actually, I think we grew up in the shadow of a couple. The one I'm
yeah,
thinking of is
yeah,
FBC, it was First Baptist Hammond
yes.
with the Independent Fundamentalist Baptists. And that's what I thought Baptists were growing up, that
Uh-huh.
was very, very, at the time, I don't think they're like this anymore, but at the time in the
Yeah,
80s and 90s, very controlling, very cultish. Um, and then I think we got a second one in the 90s because of the charismatic movement. We don't have to go there.
right.
That's not what the conversation's about. But yeah, so unhelpful to use that language. You're not going to find that kind of language in this book. I'll put it that way.
Awesome. And let's talk about the book because really, honestly,
Yep.
I think it's great. It gets a high praise from a lot of different diverse voices here. And you have this set out in five different sections. And so I'm just going to read the parts. Is what part one is studying Mormonism. Part two is the story of Mormonism. Part three is authority in Mormonism. Part four is the beliefs of Mormonism. And part five is approaching Mormonism. Keeping in mind that this is written to an evangelical audience. Okay. Um, just tell me a little bit about how did you get involved in this project, and did you and what was it like to be able to do this, because to be able to write this book must have been really interesting, fascinating, frustrating, and all sorts of things.
Yeah. So the story behind it, and then we'll go through the structure and why I wrote it, and then thank you for reminding the audience, like this, the intended audience for this book is evangelicals, but I know for a fact Latter-day Saints are going to be reading over our shoulder. So I wrote with a dual audience in mind, if that makes sense. The publisher, the general editor, Ben Merkel, reached out to me to ask if I would be interested in writing this volume. I don't know much about how the decision train came to me. I think at one intersection, at least, I have a good friend who teaches at Southeastern Seminary. He's a New Testament and Paul expert, Apostle Paul expert, and he's friends with Ben, or work associates at least. And the conversation must have come up like, hey, Kregel would really like a series on or volume on Mormonism. We just don't know who to get to write it. And Miguel's like, my friend, you really need to talk to Kyle. So they reached out to me. They asked for two samples. So I wrote the two Book of Mormon chapters
Okay.
first. There's actually, yeah. So where'd the Book of Mormon come from and what's in it,
Okay.
basically, are the two questions. So I wrote that, sent it back to them, and within a week, they're like, "Here's the contract.
Okay.
Like we dig your style. Let's go." And it took me about 2.5 years to write. Um, so the structure of the book is organized in a way that I'm trying to implicitly teach readers how to engage Mormonism, right? So I'm a big believer in explicit teaching and implicit teaching. The way I'm writing is supposed to be informing and educating. So the first question is like, why would I even want to study Mormonism at all? And I go through kind of the history of how traditional Christians, is how I define us, that have as broad an umbrella as possible, have approached Mormonism in the past. And I kind of find four modes throughout history and even to today. But what I wanted to do is like I wanted to drill straight to the core. So no matter how you do it, the why has got to be the same, and the why has to be the greatest commandment that Christ gives in the Gospels, which is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And so, one of the arguments that I make in the book is how can evangelicals be obedient to that commandment to love our neighbor as ourself if we don't understand our neighbor? And in this case, how can we love Latter-day Saints if what we believe about Latter-day Saints is a caricature, right? Or if we've been told by our family, like, have nothing to do with the Mormons, is because the vibe that I got. So how can I love a people that I have instinctual fear towards? So admittedly, the first chapter is a bit pastoral. I am a pastor by profession. It's really hard to take that hat off. So it does have kind of a devotional tone to it to begin with, but that was intentional. Then I go to the story of Mormonism. So it's history, talking about who is Joseph Smith, what was the great apostasy, what was the first vision, how come there's so many Latter-day Saints in Utah. And this is intentional too, because What I like to say is this: evangelicals care very deeply about historical theology. So when you ask evangelicals, like who are the most important theologians that shape your theological imagination, they're probably going to include the likes of Martin Luther, John Calvin, and down the line to Charles Spurgeon, um, any theologian who is past, right, in history. We don't really care about the story of how we got the doctrine. We care about the doctrine maker. So I bet if I went to like a conservative Presbyterian church and said, "Tell me about John Calvin," they're going to get the basics correct about when he lived, that he was in Geneva, but tell me about the works John Calvin has created. Now that's where the conversation is going to go because there's a ton that they would talk about with doctrine, right?
Hmm.
I found that with Latter-day Saints, though, it's exactly reversed. So
Hmm.
they're not a people of a historical theology. They're a people of a theological history that they see in the latter days, a theology unfolding before them,
Mhm.
whether it's the first vision, whether it's the great apostasy, whether it is the fact that they believe that there is a true and living prophet, seer, and revelator who heads the church today in anticipation of the second coming of Christ. This is a very theological history that's unfolding before them. And so they see themselves as part of that narrative. Evangelicals don't see themselves as part of a church history narrative. They might learn it in Bible college or seminary, but they don't see themselves as part of that. We're very atomized, we're very individualistic. Latter-day Saints, though, see their place in the next chapter of the latter days, right? So I wanted to bring that to the reader's attention. The third part then is authority. So I talk about how Latter-day Saints view the Bible, the Book of Mormon, so their scripture, Pearl of Great Price, Book of Abraham, and then I devote 3 chapters to the priesthood.
Which is important, obviously, to
This
devote
is
that.
very important, and this is actually right at the pivot point of the entire book. And this is intentional because I think the Latter-day Saint priesthood is one of the most important things about Mormonism that is least understood by evangelicals.
Hmm.
Evangelicals just don't comprehend how important the priesthood is. And so I took it's the only topic that I devote 3 chapters to because I think it's that important. I thought
Interesting.
you were going to say something. Yep.
No, no, no. I'm just taking this in, dude. So
Okay,
so yeah,
great.
the priesthood. Continue just talking a little bit more about the book, the structure.
Yeah, so then part 4 moves into beliefs, and this is the largest chunk of the book. And
Hmm.
again, that's intentional because I think this is what evangelicals are going to be most interested in, right?
Hmm.
If I was to write a book the way that I wished we would approach Mormonism, it would be like a historical development. So you get the history and the doctrine at the same time to kind
Hmm.
of cement in our imagination how important those two things are linked together. And I would talk about practice more than I would doctrine. Because
Hmm.
for Latter-day Saints, praxis, what is done and the way that it is done, is takes precedence over what is believed, right?
Hmm.
And I just find that to be a general observation as an outsider.
Hmm.
Fortunately, I'm getting the opportunity to write just that book right now with another publisher. I'm about 60% of the way through the manuscript. So I'm excited to see that project come to fruition. But I know Latter-day Saints, or I'm sorry, I know evangelicals are going to be more interested in doctrine and beliefs. So that's what I devote the most of the book to. And I break them up into kind of like beliefs that we would share. Like we both believe in God, we both believe in salvation, we both believe in baptism, Lord's Supper. So what are the similarities and dissimilarities? And then unique doctrines that we don't hold. That's the second part of, or the second section of part B, like eternal progression, temples, what is the endowment? I know that's probably going to make Latter-day Saints nervous, but the way I went about this is only using scholarly and sources that were open to me by the LDS Church. So I didn't poke around on Reddit, and then I tried to be very, very respectful to that. And then
Good.
finally, approaching Mormonism. Like, okay, so we've read this book. Now what? Maybe you've got a brother-in-law who's LDS, and you've just married into the family. You have a friend who converted. You just found out your coworker is Latter-day Saint. what do we how do we go about approaching or engaging Mormonism? And there are very different varied ways to do so, but I advocate for not the only, but my preferred mode, which is dialogue. It's
Hmm.
just discussion, trying to understand beliefs because, and I'm sure Latter-day Saints would agree here, y'all are not a monolith.
Right.
So even in this book, there's going to be Latter-day Saints to say, look, that's not what I believe. Granted, I wasn't trying to write what 16 million people individually believe. What I
Right.
was trying to do is provide as general an introduction as possible to provide a reliable starting point to have those conversations. If a Latter-day Saint wrote 40 questions about evangelicalism or Protestantism, I would probably have a field day with this. So
Hmm.
it's a red pen if you're listening.
Yeah.
So I anticipate the same thing. What
Hmm.
I'm trying to do is, can we be respectful and can I try to articulate as accurately as possible in aggregate what is Mormonism? So there you have it.
I love it, Kyle. I think that's really important. Just being able to just, in what we're doing, you and I are often involved in interfaith dialogue. And that in particular with the restoration, I kind of involved in interfaith dialogue between the different branches of the restoration at the same time, and that's kind of really an important, kind of ministries that we have in that regard, is to be able to have dialogue and having a two-way conversation. So I always tell people, people are like, well, you're probably teaching Mormons all about the Christianity and true Christianity and blah blah blah. And I'm like, well, let me put it this way. I hope they learn from me, but I also want to learn from them. I want to be a two-way conversation where we're engaging each other in a way that in a Christian way, in a way that I would want to be treated, in a very golden rule way. And I think that's so important that we do this, because I don't see Christ doing what a lot of these critics in the past have done. I think that this just let's sit down and talk. Let's reason together. Let's have these conversations. People superficially might say, well, Jacob Hansen did this debate, right? And this person debated them. And that's fine. You can debate Jacob Hansen all you want, but how about the hours of phone calls that I've had with Jacob off the record? That's the hard part. See, it's easy to tear down. It's very hard to build. And I think that maybe just talk about the importance of building these types of bridges and using, like, this book,
Yeah.
I think ultimately is a bridge building tool.
Yeah. So what you're describing here, I think is one end of a spectrum, and then there's a second end of a spectrum to an interfaith dialogue where we just kind of discount our disagreements. We just say like, we might disagree here and there, but at the end of the day, our disagreements don't really matter. These differences aren't that big of a deal, so let's just let bygones be bygones. I try to hold that tension as as tightly as possible in this book. So on the one hand, what I don't want to do is I don't want to misrepresent Latter-day Saints and Mormonism. I I try very, very hard to do unto others as I would have done unto myself and present Latter-day Saint faith and tradition and history in as accurate of a light as possible, even at points where I strongly and severely disagree. And that's a really hard thing to do, right? Like what it's and frankly, if you're a believer in one faith, writing uh, a, another faith's perspective on your own can be a bit of an emotional experience, right? So the first vision, for example, is really difficult for me, not because I don't believe visions can occur, but because of the strong, stark language that's attributed to Jesus Christ about my own faith.
Absolutely.
And me, like
Yep.
the professor or pastor
Hmm.
is abomination, and
Yeah,
that's really, really hard to hear. Like,
it is.
Joseph, no offense, like, come with me to hospital visits and funerals, be with me when I'm preparing sermons, and the people that I have in the back of my mind whose lives are completely train wrecked by sin, like, I reject that just straight up. I don't take that message. I don't want to then go anti-Mormon with it. Like
Hmm.
I'm not then going to be like anybody who believes this is dumb and in a cult. So because their beliefs are sincerely held, and I want to respect that, right? So that's really hard to do. The other thing that's really hard to do is to constantly present differences in a way that doesn't come across as combative or aggressive. The last thing I want is the spirit of contention to come from this book. So there will be parts in the book where I think they're really, really important, and as far as disagreements are concerned, and I highlight them. So, for example, the fall, the way that
Hmm.
Latter-day Saints believe the fall
Yep.
as a natural progression towards exaltation in God's plan of salvation, and that actually the step that Adam and Eve took east of Eden is something to be admired. And I've even seen language that it was heroic. I can't disagree more. I think it was completely tragic and was evil in the deepest sense of the term. So when you have that stark of a disagreement, how do you set them next to each other without it coming across as being contentious? The easy thing to do is to just mitigate it. It's to soften it, it's to contextualize it, it's to talk around it, and it's to try to lessen the tension as much as possible. But the problem with that is you're going to slip into, yeah, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. This difference isn't that big of a deal. When actually it's a huge deal, right? So, yeah, what you were talking about earlier, like we don't want to slip into anti-Mormonism, but we also don't want to slip into that syncretism either,
Yeah.
where
Uh,
differences don't matter, right? So we can't say um, differences are all that matters.
right.
We also can't say differences don't matter.
Correct.
We have to meet somewhere in the middle. And I think
Absolutely.
the best kind of engagement that evangelicals do with Latter-day Saints are trying to stay put as best as possible right there.
I love
Yeah.
it. Yeah, and I think that's important. That's I try to occupy that same type of space, And what that does is by building relationships and forging friendships with people and being absolutely blunt with our disagreements. Maybe
Yeah.
that doesn't make it on the camera, but I'm willing to, but I'm willing to have those conversations one on one off the record and learn, but and just throw my critiques at them and then let them respond. And then, you know what? Sometimes my critiques change. Sometimes I learn something that maybe I have a blind
Yes.
spot, and maybe I can learn something from this too. So maybe just about exploring Mormonism and writing this book, what things have you learned? What blind spots have
Yeah.
you identified?
That's a great question because writing a book is more about learning
Mm,
than it is about like, disseminating information. And I love this question because it forces me to reflect on how I grew and actually what I learned from Latter-day Saints. Like what could they teach me? And probably one of the things that I've been most affected by in in writing this book and specifically, but being around Latter-day Saints is the how community oriented and communal Christianity is meant to be, but how individualistic and atomized evangelicalism is. And also how evangelicals primarily see themselves as what they believe and think, and less so in what they do and behave.
hmm.
Studying the Latter-day Saints, especially their history, has forced me to reconcile with that. And then I actually started reading like the New Testament differently. I don't
Mm,
see them talking to you, Kyle. I see them
right.
talking to y'all, the church.
Yeah. Hmm.
I'm an individual member of it, but my brothers and sisters in my congregation, we are in this together.
Yeah.
One of the observations I would have never made, I don't think, if I was just to continue down this line, is that by far and away, Christians are called saints in the New Testament more than they're called believers.
Hmm.
It's not to say that belief and faith does not matter. Of course it matters. It's foundational. But the early Christians saw themselves as a collection of people who were pursuing holiness together,
Hmm. Hmm.
not primarily by what they believe. And I
Yeah.
think that we evangelicals have we've kind of like taken for granted the enlightenment vision of humanity, which is what makes you distinct from the other animals, is that you're a Homo sapiens. You're a man who thinks. You're a man who
Hmm.
reasons. You're a man who's wise. So everything's about the head,
Yeah.
and that's just not what I see in Scripture. And one of the things that led me to see that is the Latter-day Saints and their emphasis on family, their emphasis on community, and the fact that they're really adamant about the term saint, right? Like that's not a Mormon term that comes from the Bible. So
Right.
that was probably the biggest one for me.
I love it. I love it. I appreciate it. Well, I want to talk about a few things that's in the book, specifically. One, we're going to talk a little bit about the Book of Mormon because that's the first two chapters I went. The first two chapters you wrote were the first two chapters I read, just because that's our
Yeah,
Kyle and I's wheelhouse. But before we talk about the Book of Mormon, you actually posed the question: is Mormonism just an American religion? Um,
yeah.
I just want you to touch on that.
So the answer is no. Approximately half of all Latter-day Saints live outside of the United States. And the reason I asked that question was twofold. One, when you think about Mormonism, you think about Utah, you think about the Intermountain West. If you know a little bit about Mormonism, maybe you're thinking about its history in New York and Ohio and Missouri. But by far and away, the if you were to like close your mind and conjure in it the typical, what does a Latter-day Saint look like? It's probably somebody who lives in a suburb outside of Salt Lake City in Utah. But that's actually not the case. There are Latter-day Saints all over the globe. There are more Latter-day Saints in certain parts of the globe than others. So there's more in, say, South America than there is in Asia. I made an interesting discovery that there are literally more Latter-day Saints in the state of Indiana than there are the entire country of India, which is currently the most populous country on earth, surpassing China. So it's very like asymmetrical depending on where you go. But no, Mormonism is global. I talk a little bit about what it means for a religion to be a world religion. Not necessarily size doesn't quite matter, right? So we would consider Judaism a world religion, but I'm pretty sure there are less Jews than there are Southern Baptists. So size doesn't really matter, right? It's can a religion exist and thrive in multiple cultures simultaneously? And that's why we would consider Judaism a world religion, Christianity a world religion, Islam a world religion because it spans from Morocco to Indonesia, right? Mormonism, though, I think it struggles.
Yeah.
I think it exports a lot of norms from Utah, and that just kind of, or the Intermountain West in America. And so that kind of like perpetuates the fact that when you think about Mormonism, you're thinking about America and maybe eschatology too, right? So you have gathering here in like the Latter-day Saint missions history is fascinating to me as an evangelical because the way that we're trained up and the way that we understand the history of missions is that you would train up people and you would send them and the missionary would stay and hopefully raise up indigenous leadership and then the indigenous leadership would stay put. But the earliest missionary calls
Mhm.
among in Mormonism were come here, leave Scandinavia, leave Britain. There were Latter-day Saint missionaries, and they did crazy things like they would go to the Pacific Islands. There were Latter-day Saint missionaries in Pacific Islands before they were in Florida. So you had this to the ends of the earth, but not to stay there, to gather back in America. So that's really fascinating to me. And we were talking earlier Steve, but one's eschatology is one's missiology. So what you believe about the end times will affect how you behave in your activity as a church. And I think that's just one of the differences that's interesting to me. So yeah, thanks for bringing that chapter up.
Yeah, and then of course we always, whenever the Book of Mormon makes an entrance into the conversation, it will be acknowledged and it will be talked about because I'm just, I remember talking to somebody on the phone, when I went and spoke at my very first Book of Mormon rally, the organizer goes to me, he's like, "Well, Steve, okay, you don't believe in the Book of Mormon, um, but you're not against the Book of Mormon. How do you define your relationship with the Book of Mormon?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm a fan of the Book of Mormon." And they're like, "Oh." Okay, all right, he's a fanboy, and that's kind of how I see it, because I think the Book of Mormon is just a fascinating document that every time somebody thinks they have it figured out, or they got their smoking gun, or this is how he did it, or this is the influence, or blah blah blah, then something else comes up and it's like, whoa, there's something about the Book of Mormon in particular that just I find so, it's audacious, it's kind of dangerous, it's kind of weird but cool and awesome, and all the, I can think of so many different words to describe the Book of Mormon. And so I just want you to kind of talk about your relationship with the Book of Mormon and how it informed your two chapters that you wrote in this book.
Yeah, yeah, maybe some similarities and differences there. I think that the definitely the similarity between us is that the Book of Mormon was
Yep.
my gateway to Mormonism, right? And it was the curiosity of this kind of text. What does it mean? What does it do? Um, it's and then it's unique call in Moroni 10 to ask for a personal, individual, subjective confirmation of its veracity. That
Yeah.
is very different than anything that I've ever come across in any kind of religious text. Its similitude with the Bible in its language. It's got motifs in its rhythms and it sounds King Jamesy. Those are all interesting to me. At the end of the day, the most interesting thing is what it represented to the earliest Latter-day Saints as like an authenticating credential for Joseph Smith's authority. So you don't have Joseph Smith without the Book of Mormon, but you also don't have the Book of Mormon without Joseph Smith. So there's almost this like symbiotic relationship of authority for early Latter-day Saints. And without that, the whole movement falls apart, in my opinion. I don't think it ever gets off the ground and running. I think the Book of Mormon is interesting in the fact that, well, let me lay all the cards out on the table. Readers hoping for me to like come to a conclusion that the Book of Mormon is inspired or canonical or a scripture. I don't come to that conclusion. I've read it through 3 times and I've not that's just not where I land. And I hope to write on the Book of Mormon in the future. The Book of Mormon to me is something I call American pseudepigrapha. So it's a text that is falsely attributed to certain authors. So in this case, it would be the redactors of the Book of Mormon, and then ultimately Mormon himself. But at the same time, calling it American pseudepigrapha, it does not mean it's useless. That there's nothing about it that is redeemable in any aspect, and that as one knucklehead evangelical recently lit it on fire to light a cigar with, is to be disrespected like that. I don't think those things either. Again, I'm trying to like hold this tension in the center. One of the things that's useful for me for the Book of Mormon is that I believe it captures a lot of the zeitgeist of American Protestantism in the early 19th century, maybe even late 18th century. So it provides a very unique snapshot into the interests, concerns of Americans who were Protestant at this point in time. It's asking questions that are being answered. I'm sorry, it's answering questions that are being asked. Like, well, how is it fair if the Lord demands of us the hearing of the gospel and repentance? Well, why would God allow a people group to go at least 1400 years without ever having access to the gospel? Like, this would be a question you would be asking in the 19th century. And the Book of Mormon, along with people that came before it, said, well, actually, interesting you asked, we believe that indigenous people on this continent are descended from Jews and that they actually were introduced to the gospel, whether in a proto form or a pure form, is the way the Book of Mormon presents it. And so we are sustaining God's justice in that sense, right? So that's just one example. There are many, many other ones that you can find in the Book of Mormon, which is why it's an important text to me. Like, again, it provides a really unique snapshot of Scripture. And as an authority, obviously, as a Protestant and as an evangelical, the presence of the Book of Mormon suggests insufficiency of the Bible. And so that's one of the things that I talk about too in the book is what does it mean that the Latter-day Saints have extended the canon. I wouldn't say open the canon. I think that's a misunderstanding of what the word canon means. To say something is closed means it's silent. We're not hearing anymore. It's not like evangelicals believe God doesn't talk. He doesn't speak anymore, right? But extending the canon, why would we need to do that? Because there's an insufficiency in the Bible somehow that the Book of Mormon rectifies. So I talk a little bit about that too. Um, but yeah, so to me, and this may be unsatisfying, I'm more interested in what the Book of Mormon is rather than what the Book of Mormon says, if that makes sense. And I
Hmm.
know you, uh, uh, Steve, I think you're endlessly fascinated by both.
Yeah.
Like you,
Mhm.
I'll watch you riff on the gold plates, the material history, and then switch modes and talk about the narrative and the literature, and the meaning making that the Book of Mormon represents. But
Yeah, yeah, and I can't, I just can't let go of that whole conversation because the Book of Mormon just presents itself in a very unique, interesting way that I think I look at this way. If you're an atheist, you don't believe in God, you don't believe in the supernatural, then you can just say, oh, you can just summarily dismiss it. But if you're a believer and you do believe in angels and you do believe in supernatural and you do believe in Scripture, you cannot summarily dismiss the Book of Mormon.
yeah, the way I phrase it is, the question is not could God, it's would God. I think that's a healthier way to approach it, right? Because you get into all sorts of problems like, well, God couldn't visit a boy in upstate New York in a vision. Uh, okay, well, let's talk about church history. I mean, I found evidence of a Baptist contemporary to Joseph Smith who converted to the gospel in a conversion experience that mirrors or parallels very similar to the
Uh-huh.
1832 first vision account.
Yep.
So you okay, if you can explain that away, that's fine, but I'm less interested in asking could God do something. I'm more interested in asking would God do this? So
Uh-huh.
would God appear to Joseph Smith in 1820? Oh, he would if the great apostasy is true and he desires to restore his church. So then
Hmm.
it's not could the church have failed during the great apostasy? Would it have failed, right? I like the would question better than the could question. So
Okay, I love it. I love how you're framing these this approach. I think that's really cool, and I also think it's just very. I find this to be a refreshing approach. The contentions has just been there for too long, and I just have a couple of small questions to ask you, just kind of that I want to follow up on. By
yeah.
the way, I just want to make it very clear. Hold up that edition of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, this one.
I don't think I've ever told about this, but look at the shade of blue of MBR. That's
Oh, is
modeled
it the
after
same?
that. Yep, that's modeled after that color. Just so you know, that
Okay.
was very deliberate. Got golden book, right, with gold leaves, and then the blue. That's what I modeled this after. So hopefully that doesn't cause the church to go after me. But but yeah, that just wanted to give you a little background on that.
That's fun.
Um, a couple quick questions. Are Mormons legalistic? In other words, the famous clobber verse that evangelicals love to use, after all that we can do. You actually touch on
Mm.
that in your book because there's actually another way of looking at it that seems that maybe it's not as works based and legalistic as people might think it is, at least that text.
Yeah, so one of the frustrating things as an outsider studying Mormonism is that you have to come to the admission that very often Mormonism both is and is not the thing that you're you're looking at, right? So I think I opened the chapter on Christology that way, saying something to the effect that like saying that Latter-day Saints worship a Jesus that's utterly different than the one that we see in the Bible is both uh, or sorry, the way that, let me back up. I think it's precisely phrased, they worship a completely different Jesus other than traditional Christianity, is both rashly uncharitable and yet precisely true at the same time. And then I go through this litany of things about Jesus that we would both agree on, born of the Virgin Mary, had disciples, performed miracles, suffered under Pontius Pilate, and say, guess what? I got all of that information from the Book of Mormon. But at the same time, the particulars of Christology in Mormonism is very different than traditional Christianity. The materiality of him, his was he ungenerated and always the Son of God? Did he become God's son somehow? Those are very, very important conversations to have because they pull at theological threads that are critical to our faiths. So that was a Christology example. You asked specifically about was it legalistic? Ah, yeah. Okay. So yes and no at the same time, because Latter-day Saints believe all people will be resurrected from death. There's nothing that they had to do to deserve this mercy of being rescued from death, right? The legalism comes in, or the way works operate in soteriology and salvation for Latter-day Saints is not whether or not God is going to save you. It's to which degree of exaltation will you be saved to. So in one sense, no, because they believe that all people will be saved to some level of glory, with the exception of folks that go to outer darkness, but that's a very small percentage of beings. But the higher you go up, the smaller the pyramid becomes, right? And very, very few people are in celestial glory compared to, say, telestial glory. The phrase in specific that you're asking about from Second Nephi, that it is by grace we are saved after all we can do. There's been work done on this by a couple of people who point out the fact that in the 19th century, the phrase "after all we can do" would be something akin to the way that we would describe it, despite what we can do, right? Nevertheless, it doesn't matter. So what the author in Second Nephi is arguing is not that we know that it is by grace that we are saved after or in conclusion of the works that we've contributed. He's saying, so the way that the phrase is typically seen is we do works, and then where we fall short, Jesus makes up the difference. That's not what Second Nephi is saying. What Second Nephi is saying in 19th century English is we know that we are saved by grace despite everything that we do. So even if we did all these great works, that's not what's saving us. What's saving us is God's grace. And so as strange as this sounds, that's a very evangelical teaching or doctrine that you see appearing in the Book of Mormon, which leads to my suspicion that this was written by a 19th century, early 19th century Protestant.
Okay, so you led me right to, I think we're burying the lead here, because I saw this yesterday when I was reading the Book of Mormon chapters, and you say you don't believe that Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon. Now, what a major concession, because that opens up so many different possibilities. There could have been a contemporary author at the time. There could be an ancient author. Then, in other words, you can't just summarily just say, "Oh, Joseph Smith didn't write the Book of Mormon." Therefore, it seems to be that it opens up the door that if Joseph Smith didn't write the Book of Mormon, what are the implications of that?
Yeah. So here's what I'm trying to do. In my own way, I'm trying to be as honest with the evidence as possible from my perspective, right? So that pursuit has led me to the conclusion that I do not believe Joseph Smith to be the author of the Book of Mormon.
Wow.
Now, I can hear two responses already. From the Evangelicals, it's, oh, so you're just going to concede the narrative of the LDS Church. And the LDS people are saying, like, aha, Kyle's open to it being ancient scripture. And to both of them, I'd say, hold on just a second, sit down. That's not what I'm saying. Because I do believe that whomever wrote the Book of Mormon was extremely attuned to the Protestant zeitgeist of the early American Republic, that they were very theologically sophisticated and intelligent in the Bible. And this is an important distinction, because Joseph Smith grew up in a society that was drenched in the Bible. And so to say that you were completely encultured by biblical language and motif is similar, but not the same to saying that you are theologically sophisticated. I think whomever wrote the Book of Mormon has evidence that they were actually trained, or that they were a lay minister after a long season of time, that they had to work through theological questions, and they're exploring them and explaining them in in narrative form, if that makes sense. So where I don't see Joseph Smith lining up on that is how old is he when he's producing the text? His early 20s.
He's in his early 20s.
I'm not trying to be ageist, but the sophistication and the level of theological intelligence that would be required to produce something like the Book of Mormon does not fit, in my opinion, what
Huh.
we know about Joseph Smith, right? I've
Okay.
seen arguments to say like, well, Joseph was super charismatic and he lived in this kind of like imaginative world, and all of that was kind of like honed literarily through Oliver Cowdery, which is why you get this manuscript that's cranked out in mere weeks. When Oliver Cowdery shows up, he's not able to do that with his wife Emma or Martin Harris earlier in the process. I think it's the closest argument that would like persuade me otherwise, but still, gosh, that's like you read some of the apologetic materials from Latter-day Saints about the sophistication of the text. And while I disagree that it's sophisticated because it's actually genuinely Semitic or Hebrew in origin, I agree with them that it's sophisticated in the sense that there's a lot going on there that I struggle to see coming from one person who's in his early 20s and just like riffing as he goes as if it was some kind of like jazz concert, and Oliver is like struggling to keep up. Um, Whomever wrote it, I think that another way to say it maybe is that there's some kind of text, there's some kind of like original Book of Mormon beneath the Book of Mormon manuscripts that we have. And it's much easier for me to see Joseph Smith as a redactor or an editor of of whatever this text was, and he is he is producing the finished product, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So that's the best I can go on.
Well,
Um,
I mean, honestly, I just think Mormon had all these plates and he was putting it all together. And, I mean, I could say that too. Like this, he was the redactor and the editor and had all this information. I mean, that's another position one could take. That's why I think it's just the fact that we still are having these debates about the origin of the Book of Mormon, how it was translated. By the way, I just want to thank you very much for talking about like the whole translation process of the Book of Mormon, and also showing that there's a lot more nuance to that whole thing than a lot of people realize. There's a lot of really interesting things going on, just even with the seer stones, with the spectacles, the Urim and Thummim. I think it's important that people understand that that's in and of itself is a very interesting story that you touched base on as well. I guess I really, well, before I ask my final question, I did want to just talk. You did actually write a chapter. So this is primarily a book about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but you do touch base on some of the other groups within Mormonism, and you actually have a chapter devoted to
yeah.
that. Maybe talk about why you chose to talk about the groups that you talked about, and also you could kind of tie this in with, well, why are you such a big fanboy of James Strang?
Yeah. So I do. One of the biggest misconceptions about Mormonism is that all of it is concentrated in Utah. So just, to go back to the earlier question about is Mormonism an American religion? The answer is no. Another question could be asked is Mormonism only the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints headquartered in Salt Lake City? And the answer is also no. Like there's a rich diversity of Mormonism outside of the church headquartered in Salt Lake City. Granted, they're the majority by far and away, probably like what 90% or more. Like there's no way that they're not the majority. But simply because they're the majority doesn't mean that they should get they should get to dominate how we understand Mormonism. So what I do is I go and I explore very briefly, almost in just a handful of paragraphs, a number of traditions and movements that also were founded by people who believed Joseph Smith was a prophet and that the Book of Mormon is scripture. So the second largest group today would be Community of Christ, in headquartered in Independence, Missouri. And then you have the Church of Jesus Christ, sometimes described as Bickertonites from one of their prophets, William Bickerton. But then my favorite is James Strang. So James Strang, if you don't know his story, is a convert in February of 1844, just months before Joseph Smith is assassinated. At Joseph Smith's assassination, or immediately after, James produces a letter purportedly from Joseph Smith appointing him to be the next prophet. He claims to discover plates and translates them. He claims to receive something called the Book of the Law of the Lord from the plates of Laban later. He's a monogamistic alternative to Brigham Young until he's not. So James Strang secretly weds a gal named Elvira Field, and they try to conceal that relationship by dressing her up in boys' clothing and passing Elvira off as James's 16-year-old nephew. James starts what can only be described as like a proto-Marxist society on an island in Lake Michigan. He pronounces himself the king of the kingdom of God on earth, and he's ultimately assassinated by disaffected followers in cooperation with the United States Navy. Like, what is not interesting about that story? It's a fascinating part of Mormon history, and if we're only concentrating on the church in Utah, as fascinating as that is, we lose out on these other groups. So that's why
Yeah,
I wrote
I
that.
love it. I love it. And that's why, folks, as a little kid, loving to read, look at maps and looking at old Rand McNally maps and Beaver Island, they always had listed Mormon print shop is in all these Rand McNallys. And so that was always an intriguing thing to me as a youth as well. I was like, what's a Mormon print shop doing in the middle of Lake Michigan? So that answers your
Yes.
question there and answered my question too. So this is the really kind of like the elephant in the room question that I need to ask you,
Okay.
because you're going to be asked this both by Mormons and probably evangelicals, and it's this: are Mormons Christian?
There's endless debates on this topic. And I've even cited a book in this one about where the question's cleverly turned. Are Christians Mormon? Right? Like what is it about Mormonism that we see in Christianity? So the way I think about it is this. Mormonism has so radically departed from traditional Christian orthodoxy that evangelicals in particular are correct to want to challenge and push against that. So when we talk about God and his nature, for example, in Trinitarianism, it's a very different thing than the way Latter-day Saints talk about the Godhead. And because you're talking about the most basic, foundational, important elements of both of these faiths, you can't just discount that. And you can't, like I said earlier, say, let bygones be bygones. Let's just forget about this. So when I'm looking at an organization like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I'm noticing people saying like, well, the differences that we have with them are small, but they're not important. I have to reject that. Like that's insane to say something like that. On the other hand, when it comes to individuals that I know within the LDS Church, I've met people at very different
Oh,
stages of their life
mm-hmm.
that I believe, sorry, that I believe are in potential or actual communion with Christ. I think that's exactly or precisely the language that I use in one of my chapters. And I can't deny that, and I
Mm-hmm.
think it would be dishonest if I did.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that even if evangelicals think about it for more than a second, I mean, for example, like what do you do with if you're an evangelical? What do you do with people who have left the church? Like I'm thinking of like Sandra Tanner, for
Mm-hmm.
example. She left the LDS Church, but still, as far as I know, having read her biography, believed in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah,
Like, when did she become a Christian? When she stopped believing that the Book of Mormon was inspired, or when she left the church and when she had her roles removed? Like, from that perspective, right?
right. Yeah.
So I don't want to take that away, and I don't want the answer to be cheap either. I think it's a really easy thing to just say Mormonism's not Christian and no Latter-day Saints have any kind of faith worth speaking of. That's just as easy as saying like, oh, Latter-day Saints are as Christian as anybody else, right? They don't have any differences that are significant. And if that's true, like, why would a Latter-day Saint have to be rebaptized if they were joining the Roman Catholic Church? Like even Rome recognizes there's significant enough differences here to draw lines. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but
Well, I think it's a good answer because it's not a black and white answer. Because
okay,
that's not our place to. I always tell people one of the places where Mormonism started, and we've had conversations about the whether this was a literal event, or we know this is the kind of conversations we're having at the time in the 19th century America, was when that 19th century Presbyterian minister went to the Smith family and said that Alvin's burning in hell because he didn't receive a Presbyterian baptism. Now, you've written on this, but we also
yeah,
know that was a very common thought back then. This was not some kind of like thing that was made up by Mormons later. This was a real thing that was said and believed during that time. We both would agree with that. And in that sense, because people felt that they could exercise what I would call unrighteous dominion to be able to determine that somebody's in hell or not because of the pastor feels emboldened enough to say that, or a believer to be emboldened enough to say such a thing, is really where Mormonism is founded at that point. Because it's I always tell people, in one sense, Mormonism is in some sense Joseph Smith's attempt to find a way to get Alvin into heaven, and in his own kind of beautiful poetic way, kind of sort of does. And I think that's something that, you want to speak to that, because I know you've written about that. Maybe clarify on this too, because somebody brought that up as like an aha to me, and I was like, no, you don't understand what Kyle was saying there.
yeah. So what's interesting about that episode is I think it's misremembered in Mormon history. That's the thing that we've talked about. I researched it a little bit in Substack. I don't think what happened was that a Presbyterian minister at Alvin's funeral told the Smith family that he was unelect and burning in hell because he was not on the Presbyterian Church membership rolls. I think what happened, because Lucy then joins the Presbyterian Church later.
Yeah.
So why are you going to that pastor
Mm-hmm.
to sit under his spiritual guidance? Now, what I think actually happened was they had a positive experience with the Presbyterian Church until the new Presbyterian young gun pastor from out of town came in and took over and then started to teach Calvinistic doctrines of election and reprobation. Lucy asked the question, well, what does that mean for Alvin? And the pastor has to say he's probably burning in hell because he wasn't elect.
Okay.
Okay. And then William, who is where we get this story from, he tells that like in
Mm-hmm.
decades later after the fact. And he's a little boy when that happens. So yeah, is that the appropriate time? If let's say the story happened the way it did, is the funeral the appropriate time to wax eloquent about Calvinistic doctrines of election and reprobation? No, the appropriate thing to do at that point would be to weep with those who weep,
Yes,
right?
it would be
Like
the
there's a
appropriate
time,
thing. Yes.
it'd be the appropriate thing, right? So if that happens, I think that was a pastoral foul ball. It's not
Mm-hmm.
something that I would do anyway. And there was a second question that was like hidden in there that I've forgotten.
Hidden, the hidden. Oh, you want me to find my hidden question?
No,
I
not a
can't.
hidden one. I think maybe there was. I thought you were kind of asking like two things.
Oh yeah, I
Like
was asking, and I'm just trying to remember what the other question was off the top of my head, so I don't
I
recall. I
didn't.
think you covered what I wanted us to cover on that regard, but if it pops in
Okay,
your head, uh,
I didn't take notes, unfortunately.
yeah, that's okay. Well, actually, and I'm going to ask you one other quick question, and if it pops in your head to remember the hidden question, feel free to address it. But why do you mispronounce evangelical?
I don't know. I think so. Most people pronounce it evangelical. Um, I don't know. We had this conversation before? I think it's because a couple of things. One, the original Greek is evangelion,
Mm-hmm.
so it's not evangelion. And then second, At one point in my life, I was bilingual in German, and the word for Protestant is Evangelisch.
Mhm.
And I lived in Germany for a while and went to a church that has Evangelisch in its name. And
Uh-huh.
so I don't know, I changed the way that I pronounce
Well, first of all,
evangelical.
you're not mispronouncing it. I'm joking. I have found more people using evangelical, and I've always said evangelical, but I'm
Evangelical,
like,
yeah.
oh, I guess that's another proper pronunciation. And actually, yours is probably the correct pronunciation. So I'm actually probably the one mispronouncing it. Kyle, first of all, this is a wonderful conversation we had today. I just want to remind everybody, first of all, don't forget to enter the book drawing. First two people in contiguous 48 states, give
Oh,
me your
yeah.
name and address, and Kyle will send you a autographed edition. And why don't you sign it
Excellent.
right now? And then while you're doing that, Kyle, I'm going to take people over to your Substack. And so I want to also going to provide a link in the description to Kyle's Substack, where he has written many, many, many articles that, and many of them are about Latter-day Saints and the history. And I love this one. What constitutes evangelical anti-Mormonism? We had a conversation about that. And so there's some really good stuff that Kyle's putting out there. And so check out his Substack. It's really good stuff, folks. And again, like I said, I will provide a link in the description to that. Kyle, any final words before we wrap this up?
No, I'm glad to be able to have the first conversation about the book here on MBR, and I have always appreciated our friendship. And I we talk a lot off camera, and
Yeah.
this is just a fraction of it. And so I've really enjoyed our conversations we've had over the years.
Yeah, it's been great. Yeah, and I do consider it a blessing to be a friend to you. And you've also not only been a friend, but at times you've also been a pastor to me, and that's also been greatly appreciated as well. Folks, we're going to have links in the descriptions, everything we talked about, including my email address. So for those of you who want to enter into the book drawing contest, just put in the header, book a drawing, give your name, your address, and the first two people to enter will get a signed copy from Kyle Beshears that he will personally send to you. So this is an exciting thing. We'll also have links in the description to everything that we talked about. And also for those of you who are financially supporting the channel, we want to thank you so much for doing that. We couldn't do it without you. Also, just want to remind people that last week, Kyle and I actually taped an interview with Grant Underwood of this fantastic book, which will be coming out later this week as well. Kyle, I really appreciate our collaborations, and it's really great to have these conversations, collaborations, and then every once in a blue moon, we actually get to tape one and share it with the people.
Right.
It's awesome. So, folks, what did you think about this conversation? Evangelicals, I'd like to hear from you. Do you think that Mormons are Christians? Do you think that this is a helpful book? Have you had a chance to read it? Obviously, as this book comes out and you want to come back to this interview and comment on your thoughts on the book, please feel free to do so in the comments, both on my Facebook page as well as here on YouTube. But remember, the most important thing is this: all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.